Listen not to the room around you, but to the thin, invisible pressure inside the silence behind it. Let the hum of electricity, the distant murmur of traffic, the soft breathing of your own body all fall away for a moment, like layers of noise slowly sinking into deep water. What remains, if you are very still, is a quieter kind of presence. The faint awareness that the universe does not end at the ceiling above you, or the clouds above that, or the blue shell of sky you grew up trusting. Beyond all of that, there is a darkness so vast that your mind can't really hold it, only brush against it, like fingers running along the surface of a locked door. If you imagine that darkness long enough, you might feel something else inside it. Not a sound, not an image, a pressure without touch, a presence without shape. As if something out there is moving not toward you, not away from you, but alongside you, with you, matching your orbit without ever asking permission. It has no face, no voice, and yet it leans against the edge of your awareness like a memory you're sure you never lived. We took one tiny, visible fragment of that feeling and gave it a name: Comet 3I ATLAS, a shard of ancient ice and dust burning faintly as it crossed the solar system on a long, pale arc. But that name, that definition, belonged only to the part that shone. Behind Atlas, inside its path, threaded through its motion, something else stirred. Something without a name, without light, without edges. And as you sit here, in an ordinary room on an ordinary planet, that thought reaches out through the dark and taps gently on the back of your mind. What if something unimaginably old has been sharing our journey in silence, circling the same star we do since long before we even have words for fear? At first, no one saw a mystery at all. The first observations of Atlas arrived in the familiar way: numbers in columns, plots on screens, faint streaks captured on long exposures. Its brightness matched expectations for an interstellar visitor of its size. Its speed flowed neatly from the calculations. Its rotation period, its outgassing behavior, its initial orbit, each value clicked into place as though the universe were reading from a manual we had written centuries ago. A cold body falling obediently through the sun's gravity well, tracing out an elegant, predictable curve. Astronomers classified it, logged it, folded it into the growing archive of known objects. For a few quiet days, Atlas was just one more traveler passing through our sky. But the universe rarely hides its strange things in headlines. It buries them deep in the details, where only patience will ever see them breathing. Hidden in the raw tracking logs, behind calibration constants and atmospheric corrections and instrument noise, there were tiny movements that refused to stand still. A delayed shift in position here, a fractional drift there, the slightest softening of a trajectory line that should have been razor straight. When the orbit was plotted over and over again, the theoretical path and the measured one never fully overlapped. One analyst blamed the software and filed a bug report. Another pointed to high-altitude turbulence warping the incoming light. A third simply widened the error bars and moved on. Far objects are difficult to track. Some degree of fuzziness is expected. But fuzziness does not come back in the same place, at the same scale, with the same quiet insistence night after night. This did. As days became weeks and the data set grew, the wrongness began to repeat with an almost musical regularity. Random error does not keep time. Something else does. So they began to strip the system down. Jupiter's heavy hand was removed from the equations. Neptune's distant tug was subtracted. Solar radiation pressure was accounted for. The tiny rockets of gas and dust firing from the comet's sunlit surface were modeled, tested, and subtracted as well. Layer after layer of known influence was peeled away like paint, until what sure have remained was a clean, simple fall through the sun's gravity. Instead, one stubborn streak of motion still refused to disappear. A small, persistent shift that looked like gravity, felt like gravity, and yet had nothing visible to anchor it. It was like hearing a note in the music with no instrument on stage to explain it. A gravitational residue with no source, a pull from something the telescopes could not name. When numbers start whispering secrets, astronomers turn their attention back to the sky itself. A comet's tail is not just decoration, it is a map drawn in light and dust, a visible record of invisible forces sculpting the fragile object at its head. Atlas, as it approached the sun, grew the expected tail, long, pale, and delicately cyan, a hazy river of particles streaming away from the core. From afar, it behaved like any other comet's tail, pointing roughly away from the sun, shaped by solar wind and radiation like smoke blown consistently from a candle's flame. But when the images were sharpened, stacked, and stretched, when the faintest threads of dust were traced with obsessive care, something unfamiliar began to appear. Inside the glowing cloud, a subtle spiral curled outward, so faint it could easily be dismissed as noise on a single frame. Yet it returned in image after image, always twisting the same way, always with the same spacing between its ghostly coils. It looked like a slow-motion corkscrew stretched across millions of kilometers, a soft helix turning through space where only straight lines should exist. It was as if the tail were being stirred gently from behind, not simply pushed from the front. Solar wind could not explain it. Its direction was wrong, its repetition too precise. Random turbulence could not recreate it. Chaos does not trace neat spirals over and over again. And yet, there it was, dust bending toward nothing, toward a region of space where no catalog listed an object, no telescope registered even a speck, no reflected glimmer betrayed the presence of a companion. The dust, it seemed, remembered being pulled by something that left no mark on our images except through the way it rearranged what dared to glow. So the most powerful eyes we own did what they were built to do. They stared, unblinking, into the suspected region behind Atlas and demanded that light betray whatever was hiding there. What they received, again and again, was an unnerving kind of perfection. No scattered photons, no faint smears, no suspicious blurs that could be blamed on a lens or a sensor. Instruments sensitive enough to feel the warm breath of giant planets orbiting stars hundreds of light years away felt nothing. Cameras that had spotted distant dwarf worlds by their barely there glint in the dark saw no shadow crossing the star field. In that direction, light behaved too well. It traveled in clean, obedient lines, bending only according to the rules we already knew, as if nothing heavy lurked there at all. The sky, on the surface, refused to acknowledge any anomaly. But gravity is a more stubborn witness than light. While photons streamed through in apparent indifference, the comet's motion continued to tell another story. The small, precise fingerprints in Atlas's path did not care that the cameras returned emptiness. The orbit itself bent around something that never appeared on the screen. It was as though the universe had drawn a curtain across that patch of sky, not to hide some flamboyant spectacle of light, but to conceal the quiet existence of something that preferred, almost as a principle, never to be seen. The instruments remained blind, the trajectory did not. When the present will not explain itself, scientists reach backward. To understand what traveled with Atlas, astronomers took the orbit they had now and spun time in reverse. Precise equations rewound the comet's path, carrying it back through years, then decades, then centuries. Old sky surveys were dug out of archives. Glass photographic plates, their surfaces scarred and yellowed with age, were scanned and digitized. Handwritten notes from long-dead observers were transcribed into the language of modern analysis. In the smudges and streaks of those ancient records, Atlas could not always be seen clearly, but its path could be inferred. And there, embedded in the imperfect data, something all too familiar appeared. The same flavor of misalignment, softer and harder to spot, haunted the reconstructed orbit. A tilt just a little too early, a curve just a little too tight. Arrival time slightly out of step with what a clean, solitary path would predict. Atlas had been nudged before, not once, but again and again, separated by vast spans of time. When the present will not explain itself, scientists reach backward. To understand what traveled with Atlas, astronomers took the orbit they had now and spun time in reverse. Precise equations rewound the comet's path, carrying it back through years, then decades, then centuries. Old sky surveys were dug out of archives. Glass photographic plates, their surfaces scarred and yellowed with age, were scanned and digitized. Handwritten notes from long-dead observers were transcribed into the language of modern analysis. In the smudges and streaks of those ancient records, Atlas could not always be seen clearly, but its path could be inferred. And there, embedded in the imperfect data, something all too familiar appeared. The same flavor of misalignment, softer and harder to spot, haunted the reconstructed orbit. A tilt just a little too early, a curve just a little too tight. Arrival time slightly out of step with what a clean, solitary path would predict. Atlas had been nudged before, not once, but again and again, separated by vast spans of time. No known planet accounted for these corrections. No recorded close pass with Jupiter could be blamed. No wandering star, no dense cluster, no galactic tide aligned in quite the right way. Whatever companion haunted the comet now had haunted it then. This was not a temporary encounter, not the brief gravitational flirtation of two strangers passing in the night. It was a relationship older than photography, older than precision instruments, older than many of the ideas we currently use to describe the solar system. The data, stripped of romance and superstition, still whispered the same soft confession. The comet had never truly been alone. We just hadn't been listening long enough to notice. Then came the acceleration that made even the most composed astronomers go very, very quiet. Comets are pushed and pulled by an orchestra of forces, but two dominate: the sun's gravity and the outgassing jets that erupt when ice meets warmth. As Atlas approached the inner system, it did what comets do. Sunlight dug into its surface. Ice turned to vapor. Invisible jets of gas and dust roared out and pushed the nucleus like tiny thrusters, changing its speed and direction in ways we can usually predict with reasonable confidence. Models accounted for those jets, folding in their timing, their strength, their orientation. The numbers fit, until they didn't. The most unsettling increase in Atlas's velocity did not occur when the jets were strongest. It occurred just after they faded. Its surface cooled. Its active regions quieted. Yet, instead of drifting more slowly, the comet sped up. Not by a wild, chaotic amount, but by just enough to demand an explanation. When the direction of that unexpected push was calculated, it did not point back toward the nozzle-like vents on Atlas's surface. It pointed, almost accusingly, to the space just behind the comet, back to the region where light had refused to confess that anything existed. It was as if the comet were attached to something, not by a visible tether, but by geometry itself. Not deciding to move differently, but obeying a leash we could not see. Atlas was not leading, it was being led. If light will not answer and motion will not lie, you turn to the shape of space itself. Astronomers began to use Atlas as a moving probe, watching not just the comet, but what happened to the star field behind it whenever it passed through that troubling region. They aligned images taken months or years apart with excruciating care, matching star to star, pixel to pixel. Then they looked for places where the stars did not quite line up. In certain frames, when Atlas and its invisible partner crossed a specific corridor of sky, the background light seemed off. Not by much. A star that should have been here was instead a hair's breadth there. Another appeared, shifted by an amount so tiny it would have been laughable if it hadn't been so consistent. Light from those distant suns had not traveled straight. It had curved, as if passing near a small, dense weight. The effect was nowhere near strong enough to create the dramatic arcs and rings you see around massive galaxies, those spectacular Einstein crosses and halos. This was microlensing at its quietest, the faintest possible bruise in the fabric of space. Barely enough to detect, far too deliberate to ignore. In that narrow corridor, space was not perfectly flat. It had been pressed in, just slightly, by something that refused to be photographed. Whatever traveled with Atlas did not shine, did not block, did not glow, but it bent the universe around it as surely as a stone bends the surface of water, leaving ripples for those who cared to look. And so the human mind did what it always does when it presses its hands against a dark wall and feels something solid pushing back. It went to the darkest shelf in its library and pulled down old, heavy words. Some spoke, quietly, of a primordial black remnant, a micro-black hole born in the violence of the infant cosmos, when matter and energy were packed so densely that tiny regions could collapse completely under their own weight. Not the monstrous kind that swallow stars, but something small enough to fit within a city or a mountain or even less, yet carrying a mass far beyond anything that size should hold. A point where space-time is folded so sharply that light itself cannot turn the corner. Such a thing could roam the galaxy unseen for billions of years, slipping through star systems, grazing galaxies, ignoring their light and being ignored by it. Our telescopes would not notice unless, by sheer coincidence, something fragile and trackable drifted close enough to betray its presence. Something like Atlas. Yet even this possibility sat uneasily in the mind. A black hole that small, that close, should, in many models, leave louder scars. It should twist starlight more aggressively, yank harder at nearby orbits, distort time and space with a ferocity that would be hard to miss. What Atlas revealed was gentler than that. Measured, calm, almost comfortable. If this was a black object, it was not the roaring monster we imagine at the heart of galaxies. It was a relic that had long since finished whatever violent work created it, and had settled into an existence defined not by hunger, but by endurance. So another idea surfaced, stranger and somehow more graceful. Maybe the companion was not naked gravity at all, but something wrapped in a coat we could not see. Dark matter, that invisible skeleton thought to hold galaxies together, does not glow, does not reflect, does not absorb light in any normal sense. It is known only by its pull. What if, over unimaginable stretches of time, some compact core, be it a remnant, a failed star, or a small, forgotten world, had gathered a tight halo of dark matter around itself, a cloak of weight without light? Such a traveler would drift through the solar system like a ghost that carried gravity wherever it went. It would cast no shadow, show no disk, radiate no warmth. Cameras would pass right through it, capturing only the unbothered stars behind. Yet its presence would curve the paths of dust and ice, warp the trajectory of any object unlucky enough to fall into its influence. Comets like Atlas, brittle and sensitive, would tell on it instantly. Their paths would bend. Their tails would twist. Their velocities would stutter and surge in sewn patterns. If this was true, then Atlas was not a lonely wanderer that had stumbled into something strange. It was a bright bead threaded onto an invisible string that had been there all along. We were not witnessing a single curious event. We were glimpsing, through one piece of glowing debris, the edge of an unseen scaffold built of mass we cannot see and rules we do not yet fully understand. Our system, the place we call home, might be threaded with such silent structures, weaving through the dark in perfect ignorance of whether any creature ever noticed them at all. As the models grew more sophisticated and the observations more precise, a quiet symmetry began to press itself into the story. When Atlas's entire motion was simulated with the best available data, it no longer looked like a solitary object falling through a smooth gravitational field. Its speed rose and fell in cycles that hinted at energy being shared. Its path oscillated around an invisible point, as if it were tethered to something just offset from where our eyes could look. The combined motion, when plotted, resembled not a single orbit, but a dance around a shared center. One dancer shone, trailing a luminous veil of dust. The other remained a hole in the music, detectable only by the way the visible partner moved to accommodate it. Binary systems are not rare. Two stars can spend their entire lives locked together, threading around one another in intricate, spiraling paths. Pairs of asteroids spin through the dark, holding each other in small, stubborn embraces. Even black holes have been caught in pairs, circling one another until they merge in a catastrophic ripple that spreads through space-time itself. But here was a binary where only one partner appeared on camera, while the other existed purely as a set of numbers, a collection of deviations and curves. It offended a deep instinct in us that equates reality with visibility. Yet the data did not flinch. Whether or not anyone liked the implication, Atlas was bound to something that did not care if it was believed in or not. The comet's tail, once a simple visual flourish to the casual observer, had become a dense script waiting to be decoded. As high-resolution images were layered and analyzed, the spiral within the tail revealed more structure. The faint wave running along its length was not random. It pulsed. Every few hours, a new kink formed near the nucleus and traveled outward with the dust, like a heartbeat recorded in light rather than sound. The timing was too regular to be dismissed, too independent of known cometary cycles to be written off as surface outbursts. Only a secondary gravitational influence, slightly trailing and offset, could produce such repeating patterns. The dust was a screen. The unseen companion was writing upon it, unintentionally, with the only ink it possessed, gravity. Without stepping into a single image, Without offering so much as a silhouette, the silent traveler signed itself again and again in the language of spirals and pulses. Atlas, glowing softly through the black, had become a mouthpiece for something that could not speak in photons. Watching it began to feel less like observing a rock and more like listening in on a one-sided conversation, a body responding over and over to a presence that remained just outside the frame. The pulse was not alive, and yet it did not stop. It beat through the data in a way that made it hard to look away. The way it is hard not to hear a clock ticking once you've noticed it in a silent room. Then the story quietly inverted. Up until that point, everyone had unconsciously framed a situation the same way. A comet with a strange companion, a visible main character with an odd supporting role shadowing behind. But a few voices, late in meetings where only the stubborn remained, suggested that perhaps we had the roles backward. What if the true traveler was the unseen mass? What if Atlas was the side effect? In that version of the universe, the invisible object had its own deep, ancient trajectory, its own path through the galaxy. And Atlas was simply something that had been caught along the way, a luminous, melting moon orbiting an invisible planet, a lantern that did not know what it illuminated. The implication was unsettling in a way that went beyond science. We are used to thinking that what we see is the thing that matters, that brightness implies significance. But if Atlas was merely a decorative fringe around a far more consequential object, then the entire narrative bent. Our telescopes had not discovered a strange comet with an invisible friend. They had, perhaps, discovered an invisible body that happened, for a brief and unlikely time, to carry a comet as a flare announcing its presence. The universe, in its usual manner, would not have done this for us. The pairing would exist whether or not any mind ever looked up. We were not the audience being shown a performance. We were eavesdropping on choreography that had never been meant to be witnessed. More conservative explanations tried to reclaim the mystery from the edge of strangeness. One suggestion was that the companion could be a rogue world, a planet-like mass cast out of some distant system during a violent gravitational encounter, condemned to roam interstellar space without a star. Such worlds are thought to be numerous, drifting in the dark between suns, cold and blind. A rogue passing through our system could capture or be captured by objects like Atlas under the right conditions. It was, in some ways, a comforting thought. Planets, even exiled ones, are things we can picture, things we have seen. But even rogue worlds, chilled and forgotten, are expected to leak a whisper of heat from their interiors. They should glow ever so faintly in the infrared. Atlas's companion did not. No matter how sensitive the instruments, no matter how long they stared, there was no warmth. If it was a world, it was colder than our models were happy to permit. If it was matter, it was wearing physics in a way that did not fully match the clothes we had tailored for it. The numbers, once again, pressed us gently away from the neatest answer. It felt older, stranger, less like an object that fit into our existing categories and more like a rule that had slipped through from a part of the universe we had never properly studied. Still, in the midst of equations and disagreements, a quieter idea persisted like a ghost that refuses to leave a room. Perhaps Atlas and its unseen partner were not merely bound now, but had always been bound. Two clumps of material formed side by side in the swirling dust and gas that once circled the newborn sun. One remained loose, icy, fragile. The other collapsed further, becoming denser, darker, more enduring. In the chaos of those early times, as the giant planets migrated and orbits were flung into new shapes, the pair could have been torn apart, their orbits diverging. For ages they wandered alone. Then, via the patient, invisible hand of gravity, their paths were slowly curved back toward each other. Binary birth is one of the universe's favorite habits. Two stars spin together, two black holes circle in their private void, two asteroids tumble around a shared center. It seemed almost arrogant to assume that comets must always be solitary. Why not a binary of light and shadow, of ice and collapsed remnant, reunited far out in the dark where almost no one was watching? If that were the case, then what we called an anomaly might simply be a reunion, a long-delayed rejoining of two objects that had never truly ceased to belong to one another. As Atlas crept closer to the inner solar system, slipping into zones where our tools were at their sharpest, researchers focused on its flicker with a kind of obsessive patience. They measured how its brightness rose and fell, not just overall, but in tiny variations over hours and days. Beneath the obvious patterns imposed by rotation and changing solar illumination, they found a subtler beat. At regular intervals that lined up with known cycle, the timing of certain brightness changes shifted by a consistent fraction. It was as if the comet were breathing, in a way that did not quite match its spin or its jets. One theory suggested that this was the signature of internal stress. The unseen companion's gravity could be flexing Atlas like a frozen, brittle lung, squeezing it minutely as it moved through their shared field, then letting it relax. Those micro-tides might fracture ice beneath the surface, open and close vents, and so modulate the jets in a rhythmic pattern that expressed itself as a gentle, repeating stutter in brightness. It was not life, not in any sense we recognize, but listening to it was unnervingly close to putting a stethoscope against the chest of something that cannot speak, and hearing, faintly, that it is not entirely still inside. Yet, for all this added data, clarity remained a step ahead, always just out of reach. The closer Atlas came, the better the instruments performed, the more precisely its position, speed, and light could be measured, and the less sure anyone became about what exactly was moving with it. The distortions in background stars became sharper, but still too subtle to resolve into an image. The gravitational influence grew more obvious, but continued to resist any one category. It was too gentle to fit comfortably as a small black hole, too deliberate to be written off as a random cloud of dark matter, too persistent to be a passing ripple. Every time a new observation was added, it confirmed the existence of something while eroding confidence in any single description of what that something might be. It was like walking down a long, dim hallway toward a door you are certain will open onto a brightly lit room, only to find that as your hand reaches for the handle, the door has been replaced by another stretch of shadow. You are closer than you have ever been, and yet the light remains the same distance away. The universe, it seemed, was willing to let us outline the shape of our ignorance with exquisite precision, while keeping the object of that ignorance veiled. In that context, in that late-night fatigue where minds are both tired and strangely open, the question arose that had been waiting in the margins. What if we were committing a basic category error? What if there was no object in the usual sense at all? What if the companion was not matter, but condition, not a thing, but a flaw? Imagine a region of space-time that has been warped and never quite settled back, like a dent left in metal long after the impact that caused it. A compact object, perhaps, once passed through this part of the solar system and continued on its way, but the curvature it induced remained, frozen into the geometry like an invisible eddy in a river. Anything entering that region would respond to the hidden bend. Its orbit would tilt, its speed would stutter, its tail would twist. Not because there was a body there now, but because space itself had been disfigured and carried the memory of a force that was no longer present. If Atlas was moving through such a scar, then there was, in a literal sense, nothing to see. No surface to reflect light, no mass to photograph. Only a persistent distortion written directly into the fabric of reality. You cannot orbit a wound. You cannot land on a ripple. You can only measure what crossing it does to you. That idea was stranger, in some ways, than a hidden black hole. You can at least imagine flying a probe to a compact object and circling it, feeling its pull. How do you visit the absence left behind by something that is no longer there? How do you repair a dent in space-time when you do not yet understand what tools ever made such dents possible? Equations were more accommodating than instincts. The mathematics could support localized curvature. General relativity allowed for such scars in principle. But the human animals working with those equations still had nervous systems tuned over millions of years to respond to more tangible threats: claws, teeth, cliffs, storms. Here was a different sort of unease, one evolution had not prepared them for. The realization that you might be standing near or orbiting through an area of reality that does not behave the way the rest does, shaped by an event so vast or so alien that your entire species has no story for it. Many of those closest to the Atlas data would later admit, quietly, that the anomaly affected them in ways they couldn't entirely justify in scientific terms. It wasn't that they thought the companion, whatever it was, posed any danger to Earth. The trajectories were clear on that. It was the way the whole picture pressed on a particular bruise inside the mind. The knowledge that forces exist close by on cosmic scales that can move worlds and twist light while remaining utterly indifferent to whether anything alive ever learns their name. Our bodies are not wired to relax in the presence of vast, unseeing power. We have always feared eyes in the dark, predatory attention focused on us. This was something worse in its own quiet way, a presence that could change everything about our future without ever once noticing we were there. So the supercomputers kept spinning, universes inside universes, trying on different combinations of matter and curvature, dark coats and compact cores, scars and halos. In many of those simulations, pieces of the mystery clicked into satisfying alignment. The tail spiral appeared, the ancient deviations recreated themselves, the microlensing bruise matched observed shifts. But none of the virtual universes managed to hold all of the truths at once. Each solution left a remainder, some stubborn discrepancy, some rhythm unexplained, some calm that should have been chaos or chaos that should have been calm. The answers circled around something unseen, like birds tracing ever tighter loops around a point in the air where nothing visible hung. Again and again, the exercise returned to the same quiet conclusion. Atlas was not the story. Atlas was the letter slipped under the door. The visible, melting fragment that just happened to be caught in the influence of something our physics could describe in parts, but not in full. The real narrative lived in whatever it was that shared the comet's path, that bent its orbit, that wrote its presence into the dust and starlight while refusing to show itself directly. In time, the official reports were drafted. They laid out the observations, the models, the uncertainties, the possible explanations. Nowhere did they write the sentence that hovered behind every paragraph. Something traveled with Atlas, and we do not know what it was. Eventually, the comet itself faded from view. Its brightness dwindled as it moved away from the sun. Its once long tail thinned and vanished into the general darkness. The instruments turned to other targets. New comets, new exoplanets, new storms on distant gas giants. Atlas became another entry in a growing list. But the silent companion did not fade, because it had never shone. It simply continued along its path, whatever that path may be, shaping other dust, tugging on other debris, bending other beams of light that will likely never be compared with such obsessive care. Perhaps, even now, it is linked with another fragment of ice on some far-flung orbit. Perhaps it has passed through the tail of dozens of comets over eons, leaving the same faint spiral in their dust that no one had the instruments to resolve. Perhaps most of the icy wanderers we've watched were never quite alone, but we lacked the patience, the technology, or the will to notice the subtle second presence pacing them through the void. And that is where the unease deepens into something like awe. Because once you admit that Atlas may not have been traveling alone, you are forced to ask a harder question. What else in our solar system has never truly been alone, and we simply haven't looked closely enough to see its partner? If compact companions, cloaked in darkness or carved into spacetime itself, can drift silently beside obvious objects, comets, asteroids, maybe even planets, then the picture of our home star and its entourage changes. The space between worlds stops being empty and becomes instead a sea of silent influences. We assumed the sky was mostly quiet, with occasional visitors. Maybe it is crowded in a way that does not register to eyes that worship light. Maybe our maps, filled in with bright points and labeled orbits, are drawings of only half the cast. The other half, black, cloaked, or scar-shaped, moves through the same volume, shaping the paths of the luminous while never needing to announce itself. The comet, in the end, was only the first breath of recognition. Atlas allowed us, briefly, to feel the edge of a larger truth pressing against consciousness, that we may share our journey not just with planets and moons and debris, but with silent companions that neither welcome nor threaten us. They simply exist. They travel when we travel, orbit when we orbit, pull when we least expect it. And somewhere in the dark above you right now, gravity is remembering that.